Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. On January 31st, the United Nations Security Council held a meeting about Russia's military buildup on the border of Ukraine. But before this meeting could commence, Russia called for a procedural vote. Now, most of the time at the Security Council, there is unanimous consent that the topic at hand should be discussed at the Security Council. But on this day, Russia blocked consensus and called for a vote. In these circumstances, there is no veto, but in order for an agenda item to be considered, it needs to secure at least 9 affirmative votes among the 15-member council. In the end, 10 council members voted to proceed. Russia and China voted no, Kenya, Gabon, and India abstained. And this is how the highly anticipated Security Council meeting on Ukraine kicked off. And with me to help understand what happened at this meeting and any potentially significant outcomes is Ashish Pradhan, who covers Security Council affairs for the International Crisis Group. We kick off discussing this procedural vote before having a broader conversation about the international and geopolitical dynamics informing diplomacy around this crisis. Now, this episode is obviously being published ahead of my normal schedule. It kind of came together at the very last minute. We recorded our conversation live via Twitter Spaces, and we recorded it maybe like a half an hour or less after the Security Council meeting concluded. So this is a very fresh take from an expert on Security Council affairs. I think you'll enjoy it. I know I did. And now here is Ashish Pradhan of the International Crisis Group.
That was a sort of a key moment early on, just to see, it's a new Security Council with 5 members, who just joined at the start of this month, those being Ghana, Gabon, Albania, Brazil, and I'm blanking on the 5th, but essentially, I think the difficult part was for a lot of these new members to stake out a position on an issue like this. I think was tricky in any circumstance, especially given the strong interests of the U.S. and the Europeans on one side and Russia on the other. So I think the fact that the U.S. was able to get 10 votes and get the likes of the UAE, the likes of Ghana, and of course Albania as well, to support this call showed that I think it did quite a bit of lobbying behind the scenes. Because absent that, I think the tendency might have been for most of these other members to not take a strong position one way or the other. Also notable because, I think this is the first time that this iteration of a regional grouping like the A3 or the 3 African members, have split, with Gabon and Kenya abstaining and Ghana voting for holding the meeting. I think, there was some interest in seeing how China would position itself vis-a-vis the meeting. And I think, the Chinese ambassador speaking before the meeting, said quite clearly that they think this meeting is not helpful at this time because it's a time for quiet diplomacy. So certainly any, potential indications of not even a split, but even some distance between China and Russia, I think was dispatched early on. So, a few elements there, showing the lobbying and diplomacy that the U.S. had done to garner support behind the scenes, but also the sort of steadfastness with which, the China-Russia partnership sort of continues, including on this issue. But, there's more in terms of council dynamics that we can go into, once we get into the sort of meat and bones of the actual conversation.
Yeah, I will. And it's just interesting, at least to me, to note that 10 affirmative votes, while sufficient, is not like an overwhelming sort of response by most of the Security Council, by the rest of the Security Council, to America's call to hold this meeting in the first place, which I thought was interesting.
No, I agree. And I mean, I think one of the headlines for me is the fact that this meeting in itself wasn't didn't have any sort of overwhelming or headline takeaways in terms of a broad rebuke of Russia. I think we're seeing some commentary from our colleagues on Twitter and in the UN world already saying that maybe this meeting didn't go the way that the US might have wanted, because there wasn't as much of a let's isolate Russia, let's name and shame them into a little bit of a corner. That didn't happen as much as I think one would have thought. So I think that sense of an overwhelming takeaway was a little bit lacking in the end.
Can you sort of help us understand why the United States called for this meeting in the first place? I mean, this is a situation, a potential, veto wielding member of the Security Council threatening another country in which, one would not think it's right for diplomacy at the Security Council. So why would, in the first place, the United States, the Biden administration, seek to call this meeting?
I think that's really one of the core questions that at Crisis Group, we have been grappling with ever since the meeting was officially confirmed at the end of last week. I think there's a few pieces that go into it. Certainly one is that they wanted to use the platform to try to isolate the Russians. Again, I mentioned that maybe that part wasn't as successful. I think the other part of it was there was a bit of a sort of artificial time pressure, as it were, because I think there was a sense that with tomorrow being the 1st of February and the start of Russia's presidency on the council, maybe it would be a little bit trickier to set the tone of this sort of debate, with Russia holding the council's chair. But I think the other part of it was in terms of why they wanted to take this approach was how one European diplomat put it to me at the end of last week, which was it's really a battle of narratives. And it's not necessarily about coming up with any clear policy responses or doing anything sort of practically that would change the dynamics on the ground, or indeed change too much about the diplomatic initiatives going on at the regional level and elsewhere. That it's really about bringing the narrative of Russia's aggression to the council, before any escalation potentially even starts. And I think, maybe that's where some of the utility was seen from the U.S. side, was that they would have this meeting as a sort of a foundational conversation from which to build on if there's a need for further emergency meetings, if there's an escalation on the ground.
So on this idea of a battle of narratives, as that diplomat put it to you, what narrative did you see the United States and its key allies seek to establish at this meeting?
I think it was, trying to paint a clear picture of the usual Russian playbook. I think it was, I forget, I think it might have been Albania who was the one that pointed out that this is the usual Russian playbook that we see of aggression on one hand and then denial and sort of deflection on the other. So trying to paint the sort of, trying to connect the dot between how it acted in 2008 in Georgia, 2014 in Crimea, and how it's acting now to clearly articulate that we've seen this before, here's what's happening, here's why we must be really aware of this. It was also interesting to me that there were quite a few members who did speak of some role for the council, that the council can be so I think it was the UAE ambassador, for example, who said that the Security Council can be a platform for members to present their views and to present their differences and to resolve those differences. And I think that's maybe a very generous reading of the council, given what we've seen of the council and its ability to positively impact conflict dynamics in recent years. But at the same rate, I think it does echo, at least in rhetoric, maybe a utility of the council being a place where these views can be aired out in the open. And I think that was the last part of it, I think, was a quite clear articulation by Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield from the U.S., who said that we've had hundreds of meetings and conversations with officials in the region, in Ukraine, with the Russian government, but this was a time they felt the need to bring some of this out in public. So I think that, again, clearly as a sort of public diplomacy, setting that narrative part of it was quite a critical component. And I think they managed to show show and bring to the fore some of the facts and figures. Even though I think I saw, I think it was Colin Lynch from Foreign Policy saying on Twitter that he would have liked to see a bit more visual aid presented in the meetings. Certainly that could have helped. But I think that trying to lay out the facts on the ground and trying to really say that what Russia is presenting, what Russia is disputing in terms of what's happening on the ground, what they're doing vis-a-vis their troop mobilization, can easily be challenged. So I think that was part of where the battle of narratives came in from the U.S. side.
And from the Russia side, it seemed that their narrative was just like very transparent. During the Russian Perm Rep's presentation, he called into question the veracity of allegations that 100,000 troops are massing at the border, suggesting, this is just where their barracks are. And at one point, he even brought up Colin Powell's presentation to the United Nations ahead of the Iraq War to suggest that the United States was once again misleading the world about its intelligence, suggesting this massive troop buildup at the border. What did you make of Russia's attempt to establish its own narrative at this meeting?
I think it was about what we would expect. We've certainly seen from Russia on a number of different issues, both close to home when it comes to Ukraine and certainly when it comes to Crimea, especially in the last sort of year and a half or so, it's really tried to go more on the front foot at the Security Council. And what I mean by that is, instead of waiting for the annual meeting on Ukraine or meetings that are called by the Western members of the Security Council where it's forced to sort of defend itself, it's been increasingly calling for and convening meetings, especially informal meetings, which are called Aria Formula meetings, where it brings speakers, who put forward a narrative that's much more favorable to the one being presented by Moscow, saying that, living conditions, for example, are quite positive. There's been overall progress, etc., and painting Kiev as the bad guy in that equation. And I think we've seen in this case as well sort of a similar attempt by Russia and Ambassador Nebenzia to try to put forward the sort of narrative that firstly that it's the one that's being pushed into a bit of a corner in terms of the threats that it's facing, saying that the need for this meeting was completely unjustified. But also, I think, trying to take advantage of or trying to draw a bit of a wedge using the comments of Ukrainian President Zelensky, which I think have been aimed at not triggering a panic, domestically, to say that, look, even the Ukrainians themselves say there's no need to panic, that, no one's looking for war, etc. So why are we having this meeting? And I think that in a way was a clever thing for him to evoke, again, trying to use the sort of Ukrainian sort of top leadership view to Russia's advantage. But, I think how Ukraine and the Ukrainian ambassador who spoke at the end of the meeting played it was interesting as well, where I think you noted, Mark, that it was a very different tone in parts of his speech where he talked about the fact that Kiev is ready to defend itself, if Russia decides to go in that direction. But at the same time, he did speak about the fact that they're hoping to use all diplomatic channels and really hoping to pursue the path of dialogue to prevent that from happening. So in some ways, I think Russia's efforts to try to drive a bit of a wedge was interesting, but also didn't necessarily play out the way that they would have wanted either. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and again, keeping on this idea of like these battle of narratives is as like kind of the main purpose of this Security Council meeting. I mean, it seemed to me that other than this idea that some countries, China most among them, suggested that the Security Council wasn't like the right forum to discuss this, that we need quiet diplomacy right now. You didn't really see any other members of the Security Council in any meaningful way endorse like the Russian narrative, unless I missed something. I mean, you did see at the end Belarus spoke, but they're not a member of the Security Council. Did you hear anything from any of the other 14 members of the Security Council suggesting to you that any other member of the council is even sort of remotely allied with Russia at the moment, or is endorsing of their narrative?
So there's a couple of bits and pieces. So India, for example, in its remarks, I think really focused on, resolving this through the existing format and through the Normandy format and existing mechanisms there. Brazil's comments, which I think were interesting, trying to maybe split the difference a bit, because as you noted, Mark, Brazil actually voted in favor of holding the meeting, which I think might have been a bit of a surprise to some, given that I think there's been an expectation that Brazil would more align itself with Russia and China when it comes to broader council issues than the other members of the 15. But at the start of his remarks, the Brazilian ambassador really said that both threats of military action and escalation, but also threats of unilateral sanctions are unhelpful in this current situation. So it sounded like trying to hedge a little bit where Brazil supported the U.S. in holding the meeting, but also echoed what's typically very Chinese and Russian line of going against sanctions. So there's bits and pieces in terms of the Russian narrative that we saw from some members like India and Brazil kind of being echoed a little bit, but certainly not to the same degree with which China, for example, which ended its remarks saying that Russia's concerns should be heeded, that NATO and its expansion is really a problem that has to be addressed in some shape or form. So I think, obviously China being the much more weighty, much more vocal backer, was hard to replicate for any of the others. But there are, again, certain elements which suggested that India doesn't see this issue being positively discussed at the council. Brazil doesn't see the utility or use of imposing unilateral sanctions, etc., which fit with some of the Russian talking points.
So I wanted to focus a bit more on Chinese diplomacy at the Security Council and more broadly when it comes to this crisis. I was personally most interested going into this meeting to see how the Chinese would position themselves. Just last week, they reiterated their call for a truce during the Olympics, which I think starts next week or maybe even later this week. So I was sort of expecting, perhaps wrongly, that the Chinese Perm Rep would be explicit and once again reiterating that call for an Olympic truce. He did not. Rather, his emphasis, as you said earlier, was that the Security Council is not an appropriate forum for discussing this issue at this moment. What do you make of Russia's position on the Security Council vis-a-vis the Ukraine crisis right now? Like, what did today's meeting reveal to you?
So you meant China's position, right, Mark? I think you...
Yeah, pardon me. Yeah, China's position, yeah.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I have to admit, I was looking at the same thing where I was wondering, are they going to, make some sort of rhetorical appeal that with the Olympics coming up and a, supposed Olympic truce, that, that should be further reason for both parties to avoid escalation. I think obviously they avoided doing that for whatever reason, but, their statement, did talk about the need for the fact that, they said there is a need for diplomacy, in a way, and talked about the need for dialogue, and urged parties to continue pursuing talks. At the very least, suggest that they agree that there's something that needs to be talked about. There's something that needs to be resolved, even though obviously, again, they sided with Russia's interpretation of NATO's expansion being at the core of the problem. They also talked about the fact that I think what they echoed in terms of Russia's talking point, which was there really is no basis for concerns regarding our war, which is a little bit worrying, right? So they didn't go nearly as far in terms of being a slightly more nuanced, taking a slightly more nuanced position, vis-a-vis the potential of escalation. So in a way, it seemed much more lockstep, with the Russian position than, certainly one might have hoped. I think it'll be interesting to see how some of this plays out. If there's a sort of a your next emergency meeting that has to be called between now and the 17th, which is when, interestingly, there's the regular meeting of the Security Council, on Ukraine, which happens every February. It just so happens that this time it's happening when, tensions on the ground are really almost at unprecedented levels, and also at the same time that Russia holds the Council presidency. But I think whatever happens between now, then and beyond, I think we'll really start to maybe tease out a little bit more of the Chinese position. We may well see them just sort of toe the Russian line and not really deviate much from that. Seeing that there's they see not much value in trying to carve out a sort of a more specific position. But when it comes down to it, I think this is what the Norwegian ambassador was pointing to when she said that she didn't mention China, but she definitely mentioned Russia, and saying that look, Russia is the one that talks all the time about sovereignty, territorial integrity being sort of principles of the international system. Well, we hope that they live to that standard. In the case of Ukraine, so you would think China, of course, is another state that really harps on those two principles a lot. In all council discussions. So I'm sure quietly they would be worried about what Russian aggression would mean for the sort of the broader respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity. But whether they actually articulate that openly, especially in a council meeting, today it certainly didn't indicate that they were willing to go that far just yet.
Ashish, I'm interested in sort of learning from you what role you see the Security Council playing in sort of relation to other diplomatic avenues that are ongoing in dealing with this crisis in Ukraine. You have the so-called Normandy format, for example, in which Germany, Ukraine, France, and Russia are meeting and have regularly met to discuss this crisis. You have ongoing diplomacy at the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Broadly speaking, going forward, what role do you see the Security Council playing in terms of mitigating or presenting opportunities to avoid, say, a worst case scenario in which Russia, in fact, does invade and war breaks out?
Thanks, Bob. I think that's another important question as well. And I have to apologize to, I think, some of the listeners who might be joining in, with great hopes of the council making a meaningful difference. But I think the likelihood of that is quite remote. Again, partially that's because of the veto in Russia, holding a veto with which it can really put a stop to any considerable diplomatic initiatives that are presented at the council. I think at most we would see the council being used as the kind of platform for what was termed by the Chinese ambassador today for microphone diplomacy, and to try to set the narrative, to try to put a bit of diplomatic pressure on the other side, and especially for the Western members for the U.S. and the other Western members to maybe try to back Russia into a bit of a diplomatic corner. Now, a couple of things there. The first, which is also something that I was discussing with some diplomats last week, was, no matter what you try in terms of trying to isolate Russia, and we've seen this over over a dozen resolutions which Russia has vetoed on Syria, since the start of the Syrian civil war, that Russia never really responds in the way in which you would hope or expect or wanted to respond. That, it certainly wouldn't. I think Russian Ambassador Nebenzia today said in his remarks right at the very outset that, the reason we called for a procedural vote was not because we're afraid of having this sort of discussion. So I think, Russia will, the sort of Russian diplomatic corps is usually quite good and quite adept at, using diplomatic and sort of the UN Charter and the different sort of working methods of the Council and the UN to their benefit. So getting one over on them at the Council certainly seems like a remote possibility, even when it comes to taking them by surprise. So that's one. I think the other part of it will be to see how Council diplomacy dovetails or let's say interacts with regional diplomacy. So one of the things, for example, one of the reasons I think that we had this meeting being held today versus the end of last week was, I think, from what Crisis Group understood, France wanted to hold off on holding this meeting until President Macron had a chance to have the call with President Putin, and that they wanted to give that an opportunity to take place before the council convened. And obviously, that's a very sort of anecdotal. It's only sort of one small example of how council diplomacy can take a backseat to whatever's happening at the regional level. And I think we'll continue to see that. And I think, of the European members, you mentioned the Normandy format. Obviously, there's been a lot covered about Germany's view vis-a-vis Russia. Maybe that's shifting a little bit. Maybe that's toughening up a little bit, especially if there is an actual invasion. Certainly, France's view towards Russia, including at the Security Council, has been a little bit more, I guess, nuanced and trying to be a little bit more accommodative might be too strong of a word, but it's certainly a little bit different than their other P3 members, the UK and the US, where they've tried to take slightly more maybe cooperative tone to trying to engage with the Russians, even on difficult issues, including including Syria in the past. So I think, seeing how these members that have a stake both at the regional level, but also here at the council, will try to calibrate the maybe sometimes quite ambitious or proactive tendencies of the US will be, just one of the interesting sort of subplots that, even within the allies, what do people see as the useful times where the council can step in, can play a role? And I think I'll also point out that this meeting today was, if I'm not mistaken, officially only called by the US. I don't think any of the European members officially joined them in sort of co-sponsoring the meeting, which isn't necessarily a huge deal, but also in sort of other occasions, maybe we would have seen if the timing was a little bit different. If, let's say, down the line, if the talks completely failed to deliver a breakthrough, then I think we would see a much more sort of united effort. But until then, I think it seems like there's a little bit of hedging going on as well.
So maybe I'll just conclude by observing, I've followed the Security Council for a long time, having covered the United Nations as a journalist since like 2005. And, the one thing I think maybe like my one big takeaway from this meeting was that I expected there to be a little more daylight revealed between China and Russia than actually was. And China's decision to sort of use the opportunity of the meeting to condemn the format, as opposed to say anything substantive about Russia's military buildup and ahead of an Olympics that they're hosting later this week or next week, was, at least to me, interesting and significant. Is there like one kind of big takeaway that you would want to discuss, wanted to point out before we open it up to questions from the audience?
Thanks, Mark. I think that's certainly one. I think, again, the other for me is that there wasn't a sort of as much of a vocal, widespread, unified rebuke, even among those members that voted for the holding of the meeting, a rebuke of Russia and Russian aggression as much as I think the U.S. would have wanted. And I think we saw a lot of appeals for dialogue and pursuing this through the existing formats and Normandy, etc., and the OSCE to play a role. But what we didn't see was a complete sort of Russia is taking all these steps. It's the reason for this aggression. It must stop. Etc. We didn't see that. So I think that in its own right is a bit of a takeaway for me.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Ashish and to all who participated in this last minute gathering on Twitter. It was a very timely conversation, and I hope you enjoyed it. I know I learned a lot from Ashish. All right, we'll see you next time. And as always, please send me your thoughts or suggestions of people I should interview or topics I should cover. I love hearing from you. All right, we'll see you next time. Bye.